The soy is not sitting beside the chicken. It is inside it. Every day, millions of people buy meat, eggs, cooking oil, frozen meals, and processed snacks without believing they are buying soy. There may be no soybean pictured on the package, no soy milk, no tofu, nothing that looks like a bean. But modern food does not have to show you its ingredients to depend on them. Soybean meal has become one of the dominant protein sources behind industrial animal feed. It helps raise chickens, pigs, fish, and other animals at a scale earlier generations could barely imagine. Its oil enters kitchens, factories, and fuel systems. One crop feeds several industries, each demanding more land, more crushing capacity, and more shipments. That is the modern trap. Soy appears to be one choice among many. Meat or plants, food or fuel, cheap or expensive, natural or industrial. But the same bean can exist on both sides of every choice. Long before a chicken breast reaches the refrigerated shelf, soy has already passed through a field, a crushing plant, a feed mill, a transport network, and a global commodity market. So the question is not whether you consume soy. The question is how much of the modern world has been built to make sure you consume it without ever knowing. The first thing modern industry does to a soybean is destroy its shape. Inside a crushing plant, the beans are cleaned, heated, cracked, and stripped of their hulls. Rollers flatten them into thin flakes. Pressure or solvents draw out the oil, which moves toward tanks and refineries. What remains is toasted, ground, and sold as protein-rich meal. One crop leaves the plant as two commodity streams. The oil can become cooking oil, shortening, packaged food, biodiesel, ink, paint, or another industrial material. The meal moves mainly toward feed mills, where it is blended with grain, vitamins, minerals, and other ingredients for poultry, pigs, dairy animals, and farmed fish. At one feed mill, a truck pulls beneath a metal chute. Pale meal pours into the trailer until the crop becomes a weight on a delivery document. The driver leaves for an animal facility. From that moment forward, the soybean will be measured as growth, feed efficiency, eggs, meat, or milk. Its original appearance no longer matters. This division helps explain why soybean production expanded so dramatically during the 20th century. The world was not simply demanding more soy foods. It was demanding several things at once. More edible oil, more animal protein, more processed products, and eventually more fuel. Soy could serve all of them. That versatility connected industries that seemed unrelated. A refinery could value the oil while a poultry company valued the meal. A food manufacturer could buy one fraction of the bean while a feed producer absorbed the other. Processing made the crop more useful because every part could be directed toward a different market. It also separated consumption from production. A person eating pork in one country might depend on soy grown in another, crushed near a port, traded by a multinational company, and priced according to markets operating thousands of miles from the farm. The final product could carry the cost of seed, soil, machinery, shipping, and land without carrying the soybean's name. The bean did not acquire power by remaining whole. It acquired power by being divided. To understand how one seed became valuable to so many industries, we have to return to a time before crushers, feed mills, and cargo ships when soy was still a difficult plant in an East Asian field, and its future depended on whether a farmer could catch its seeds before they scattered into the grass. The first problem with soy was not how to sell it. It was how to keep it from escaping. In an East Asian field thousands of years ago, a farmer reached toward a dry soybean pod. Before the hand closed, the pod twisted open with a sharp snap and threw its seeds into the grass. That was useful for a wild plant. Seeds scattered farther, survived, and produced another generation. For a farmer, it was a loss. The wild ancestor of the modern soybean was smaller, more fragile, and far less cooperative than the crop planted today. Its pods shattered easily. Its seeds were hard. Many remained dormant until conditions were right. The plant had evolved to survive without human help. People slowly forced it into a different future. Season after season, farmers saved seeds from plants that held their pods longer, produced larger beans, ripened more predictably, and yielded more food. No single person invented the soybean. Its transformation was distributed across generations whose names were never recorded. Archaeologists and geneticists still debate exactly where and when domestication occurred. Evidence points broadly to a long process across East Asia, rather than one clean moment of discovery. What is certain is that the cultivated soybean did not simply appear. Human selection reshaped it. But growing a more manageable bean solved only the first problem. Soybeans were not wheat berries that could be ground quickly into bread, or fruit that could be eaten straight from a branch. Raw beans were tough, bitter, and difficult to digest. They contained compounds that reduced the body's ability to use some of their protein, unless the beans were properly heated or processed. So, the next transformation happened indoors. In one workshop, soaked soybeans were crushed with water beneath a stone grinder. A pale liquid ran through cloth while the fibrous pulp remained behind. The liquid was heated. A mineral-rich coagulant was stirred into it. Slowly, soft white curds separated from the liquid and were gathered into a cloth-lined mold. A weight was placed on top. Hours later, the beans had become a firm block that could be sliced, cooked, stored, and shared. Elsewhere, soybeans were packed with salt and left to ferment. Microorganisms changed their flavor, texture, and chemistry. The result could become a thick paste, dark seasoning liquid, or preserved food with an entirely different identity from the original seed. This was soybeans' first great power. Not abundance, but transformation. It could become milk-like liquid, curd, paste, sauce, fermented beans, or oil. The same crop could enter meals in radically different forms, each shaped by local knowledge, climate, and taste. For centuries, soy remained embedded in these visible practices. The people who grew it often knew how it was soaked, cooked, pressed, or fermented. The distance between the field and the meal was short enough to understand. That would change when the bean crossed oceans. In the industrial West, the central question would no longer be how soy could be prepared for the table. It would be how much could be extracted from it. When the soybean crossed the Pacific, it entered a world that did not yet know what to do with it. In the 18th century, small quantities reached British North America, where growers experimented with the unfamiliar plant. It was not immediately treated as a staple. For much of the 19th century, American farmers were more likely to see soy as forage, green manure, or a botanical curiosity than as something that belonged on the dinner table. That changed when agricultural scientists began looking at the bean as a collection of useful properties. In an experimental field, rows of soybean varieties stood at different heights. Some matured early, others held more oil. Some survived in climates where imported varieties failed. Researchers measured stems, pods, seed color, yield, and growing time, searching for plants that could fit American machinery and American farms. The question had shifted. They were no longer asking how generations in East Asia had prepared soy for a meal. They were asking what the seed contained and how efficiently those contents could be removed. By the early 20th century, new processing plants began treating soybeans as oil seeds. Workers cleaned the beans, cracked them, removed their hulls, and reduced them to flakes. Heat and pressure, or later chemical extraction, pulled out the oil. A pale stream flowed towards storage tanks. The dry material left behind fell from the machinery in loose flakes and meal. At first glance, the oil appeared to be the valuable product. It could be refined for cooking, mixed into shortening and margarine, or used in paints, soaps, inks, and other industrial goods. The remaining meal looked secondary. The residue left after the part manufacturers wanted had been removed. Henry Ford saw almost no limit to that kind of thinking. Beginning in the 1930s, Ford invested in soybean research because he wanted farms and factories to supply each other. Soybean oil appeared in automobile paint. Researchers at Greenfield Village experimented with soy-based plastics and molded panels. In 1941, Ford and chemist Robert Boyer presented an experimental car with a tubular steel frame and 14 plastic body panels. The vehicle became famous as the soybean car, although the precise formula of those panels has been lost. It was not a car grown entirely in a field. It was a demonstration of an idea. Crops could become industrial materials, and farmers could supply more than food. Then the overlooked half of the crushed bean found its own market. Feed researchers learned that properly heated soybean meal provided a concentrated source of protein that could be blended with grain. What had seemed like residue could help animals grow. A worker watched the meal pour into a rail car beneath the plant. It no longer resembled food. It carried no memory of tofu, fermented paste, or the farms where soy had first been domesticated. Yet this dry material would soon become more important than nearly anyone standing beside the crusher understood. The oil had given American industry a reason to process the soybean. The meal would give the world a reason to plant it almost everywhere. The soybean's most consequential transformation did not happen in a kitchen or a laboratory. It happened in a feed formula. By the middle of the 20th century, animal nutritionists were trying to solve a basic industrial problem. Grain could provide animals with energy, but energy alone did not build muscle, feathers, organs, or eggs. Poultry and pigs also needed protein and, more specifically, the right balance of amino acids. Soybean meal fit the gap unusually well. At a feed mill, a nutritionist stood over a table of figures. Corn supplied most of the calories. Soybean meal supplied much of the protein. Minerals, vitamins, salt, and smaller ingredients completed the mixture. A change of only a few percentage points on paper could alter how quickly thousands of animals gained weight. The formula looked simple. The system built around it was not. Soybean meal had to be processed correctly. Raw soy contained compounds that interfered with digestion and protein use. Too little heat left some of those compounds active. Too much heat damaged the protein the feed mill was trying to preserve. Industrial processors learned to toast the meal within a narrow range, creating a more reliable ingredient that could be tested, priced, shipped, and blended at scale. That reliability mattered. A farmer feeding animals from local scraps, pasture, or seasonal grain accepted variation. An industrial producer could not. Birds in one building were expected to grow at nearly the same rate, reach market weight on schedule, and consume a predictable amount of feed. Every delay cost money. Soybean meal helped turn animal growth into something that could be calculated. A truck arrived beneath a feed mill's storage bins. Corn poured from one chute, soybean meal fell from another. Inside, machinery ground, weighed, and mixed the ingredients before blowing finished feed into another trailer. Hours later, the trailer backed toward a long poultry house. The soybean was now inside the ration, but no longer visible as a crop. Beginning in 1945, the A&P grocery chain, working with the United States Department of Agriculture, sponsored the Chicken of Tomorrow program. Breeders were challenged to produce birds with broader breasts, heavier thighs, and more usable meat. Entries were raised under controlled conditions and judged by measurable commercial traits. The contest turned a chicken's body into an industrial target. But genetics alone could not deliver that target. Faster-growing birds needed reliable feed, controlled housing, hatcheries, veterinary care, refrigeration, mechanized processing, and companies capable of coordinating the entire sequence. Soybean meal did not create this system by itself. Without a concentrated and widely traded protein source, however, the system would have been harder to scale and more expensive to maintain. The result changed what meat meant. Chicken had once been relatively costly and seasonal in many households. Birds were often kept for eggs and eaten later. Industrial production reversed that logic. Chickens were bred specifically for meat, raised in controlled environments, and brought to market far faster than earlier birds. The price fell. Consumption rose. The same model spread through pork production, egg operations, dairy rations, and eventually aquaculture. Soybean meal became one of the standard proteins behind animals that would later appear as entirely different products. First, crushing erased the bean's original shape. Then, the animal erased its name. A consumer did not buy soybean meal. They bought a chicken breast, a carton of eggs, a pork chop, or a farmed fish fillet. The field, crusher, feed mill, and ration had been folded into the final product. That made cheap meat look self-contained, as though it began with the animal itself. It did not. Behind the refrigerated shelf was a second agricultural landscape devoted not to feeding people directly, but to feeding the animals people wanted to eat. And as demand for meat grew, that landscape would need more land than the old soybean regions could provide. The frontier was about to move south. The next great soybean frontier did not begin with empty land. It began with a problem. For decades, Brazil's soybean industry had been concentrated in the cooler south, where soils and seasons were closer to the conditions the crop already knew. Farther north and west lay the Cerrado, a vast tropical savanna across central Brazil. To outsiders, parts of it looked open and underused. They were not. The Cerrado held grasslands, woodland, wetlands, deep-rooted plants, wildlife, farms, villages, and communities whose lives did not appear on commodity maps. Its soils were often acidic and low in nutrients available to crops. Soybean varieties bred for temperate latitudes struggled under tropical day lengths. Turning this landscape into an export zone required more than clearing vegetation. It required science. Researchers selected soybean varieties that could flower and mature under shorter tropical days. Farmers applied lime to reduce soil acidity and fertilizers to correct nutrient shortages. Improved inoculants helped soybean roots work with bacteria that fixed nitrogen from the atmosphere. Machines replaced labor across fields measured in thousands of hectares. In 1975, Brazil established Embrapa Soybean, a public research center dedicated to developing production technologies, especially for tropical regions. Its work joined a much larger campaign involving government credit, roads, private investment, land settlement, and research. The result changed the geography of the crop. A combine moved through a field in Mato Grosso. From the cab, the rows seemed to run without interruption toward the horizon. Behind the machine, harvested beans filled a truck. Ahead of it stood a landscape that had been made legible to the commodity system, mapped, divided, financed, planted, and connected to a buyer. But the field was only the first stage. Soybeans grown hundreds of miles from the coast had to reach crushers and export terminals. Trucks crowded long highways. Grain elevators and silos rose beside new transport corridors. Railways, river routes, and northern ports gradually reduced the distance between the Cerrado and foreign feed mills. At a roadside terminal, a driver waited beneath the sun while a line of loaded trucks barely moved. The beans in the trailer had already been sold according to moisture, weight, currency, shipping costs, and prices set far beyond the farm. The crop was in Brazil. Its economic future might be decided in Chicago, Shanghai, or Beijing. This expansion produced wealth. It raised output, supported export revenue, and turned Brazil into a leading agricultural supplier. It also increased land values, changed local economies, and rewarded farms able to operate at enormous scale. But the frontier did not move across a blank surface. In western Bahia and other parts of the Cerrado, Gerozero communities combined small subsistence plots with cattle grazing, fruit gathering, medicinal plants, and shared access to native grasslands. During the dry season, access to springs, veredas, and upland pasture could determine whether animals and families endured until the rains returned. A fence across an old route was therefore more than a boundary. It could separate cattle from pasture, a family from water, or a community from land it had used collectively for generations. Researchers studying communities on the margins of soy farms found that access to land and water could narrow even when production met formal environmental standards. For those families, rising land values did not automatically mean prosperity. They could mean that a landscape used through custom and collective practice was being redefined through deeds, survey lines, and private control. When native vegetation was cleared, the loss extended beyond trees. Deep-rooted plants that stored carbon and moved water through the soil disappeared. Wildlife habitat fragmented. Fire patterns changed. Springs and streams came under new pressure. The benefits and costs did not travel together. Profit could leave through a port. Dust, restricted access, land conflict, and ecological change stayed behind. Soy was not the only force reshaping the Cerrado. Cattle ranching, other crops, infrastructure, speculation, and government policy all played major roles. Nor did every soybean field replace native vegetation directly. Many expanded onto previously cleared land, but global demand gave the frontier momentum. The more meat production required protein, the more crushers needed beans. The more crushers expanded, the more valuable suitable land became. The cheap chicken breast in one country began exerting pressure on landscapes in another. This was the real geography of industrial meat. The animal could be raised near a city. Its feed could begin on the other side of an ocean. By the time the soybean reached the port, the distance between consumer and field had become almost impossible to imagine. And soon, one buyer would become powerful enough to redirect that entire flow. A soybean shipment can begin its journey before sunrise in Mato Grosso. At the farm, an auger lifts the harvested beans into a truck. The driver carries paperwork listing weight, moisture, and destination. By the time the truck reaches a terminal, the cargo has already become something more abstract than food. It is a contract, a price, a future delivery, and a promise to a buyer on another continent. The beans move from truck to silo, from silo to railcar or barge, and eventually into the hold of a bulk carrier. Tens of thousands of tons disappear below deck. When the hatches close, an entire landscape has been compressed into a shipment. Weeks later, the vessel reaches a Chinese port. Cranes unload the beans into another network of conveyors, storage bins, and crushing plants. Oil moves toward food manufacturers and industrial users. Meal moves toward feed mills, supplying pig farms, poultry operations, dairy herds, and aquaculture. The soybean has crossed an ocean only to be divided again. China's demand for imported soy grew with rising incomes, expanding livestock production, and the need for protein-rich feed. Domestic farmers could not supply the enormous volume required without displacing other crops or using far more land. Imports allowed the country to bring foreign farmland into its food system without owning that land directly. Brazil became the largest supplier. The United States remained another major source. That created a relationship built on both trade and vulnerability. In 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods as part of a widening dispute over trade and technology. China retaliated with an additional 25% tariff on American soybeans. Almost immediately, a crop planted across the American Midwest became less competitive in its largest foreign market. At an elevator in Iowa, soybean bins, they could not reverse the season because governments had changed the rules after the crop was in the ground. Across the equator, the same conflict created an opportunity. Chinese buyers purchased more Brazilian soy. Brazilian prices strengthened. Traders redirected ships. Landowners and producers saw a reason to expand. A tariff imposed between Washington and Beijing helped increase the value of a field in Brazil. This was not the first time politics had altered agricultural trade, and it would not be the last. Drought could reduce a harvest. African swine fever could cut feed demand by killing millions of pigs. Currency movements could make one supplier cheaper than another. A blocked port or delayed river shipment could change prices thousands of miles away. But soy made this interdependence unusually visible. 3 countries had become joined by one crop. Brazil supplied land and an expanding export system. China supplied enormous demand. The United States supplied both soybeans and a competing agricultural model. None could act without affecting the others. A farmer might work alone in a machine cab, but the value of the harvest depended on rainfall in another hemisphere, animal disease in another country, and decisions made in government offices far from the soil. The soybean had become more than a crop moving through trade. It had become a lever, and the next force pulling that lever would not come only from food. It would come from the fuel tank. The soybean's newest competition is not another crop. It is the fuel tank. At a crushing plant, the same division still takes place. Oil flows in one direction, meal moves in another. But the buyers waiting at the end of those lines have changed. For decades, food manufacturers purchased soybean oil for frying, baking, margarine, dressings, and packaged products. Biodiesel added another market. Then renewable diesel expanded demand for fats and vegetable oils that could be processed into a fuel chemically similar to petroleum diesel. A refinery operator does not see a traditional food crop arriving at the gate. The delivery is measured as feedstock. Tankers unload soybean oil beside animal fats, used cooking oil, and other vegetable oils. Each material competes according to price, availability, policy incentives, and calculated carbon intensity. Government rules can determine which feedstock earns more and which crushing plant expands. That demand reaches backward. When oil becomes more valuable, processors have another reason to crush soybeans. But crushing does not produce oil alone. Every additional bean also creates meal. More fuel demand can therefore send more protein into an animal feed market that must find buyers for it. The two halves remain tied together even after the machine separates them. A field can serve the cooking oil market. It can support chickens, pigs, and fish through soybean meal. It can contribute to biodiesel or renewable diesel. It can supply packaged food, industrial products, or plant-based protein. These uses are often presented as separate choices. They are not. At a supermarket, a consumer may choose between animal meat and a soy-based alternative. At a fuel station, another person may choose a diesel blend promoted as lower carbon. Both choices can pull on the same crop, crushers, and land. That does not make every use equal. Nor does it mean soybean-based fuel is automatically worse or better than petroleum. The outcome depends on how the crop was grown, what land was converted, what feedstock it replaced, how the fuel was produced, and which emissions were counted. But the promise of a cleaner product can mislead when the landscape behind it remains outside the frame. Soybean once belonged to a visible food culture. Then it became oil and meal. Meal became meat. Oil became food and fuel. At every stage, the bean acquired another market and lost another piece of its original identity. That is the modern trap. Soy appears to offer many alternatives while sitting underneath several of them at once. The world is no longer asking only how much soybean people want to eat. It is asking how much oil refiners want, how much protein livestock systems need, and how much land can be recruited to satisfy both. The crop has not reached the end of its history. It has become harder to escape. And after thousands of years of selection, processing, trade, and expansion, the soybean is ready to return to the ordinary product in the viewer's hand. Tomorrow, the chicken will still look like chicken. The egg will still sit inside its carton. The cooking oil will still pour from a clear plastic bottle. Nothing on the shelf will ask you to imagine a soybean field. But the field is there. Inside the product is a wild pod, snapping open before an ancient farmer can catch its seeds. A stone grinder turning soaked beans into pale liquid. A cloth tightened over fresh curds. A crushing machine separating oil from protein. There is a nutritionist adjusting numbers on a feed formula. A truck waiting outside a silo in Mato Grosso. A ship crossing the ocean with an entire harvest sealed below deck. A farmer watching the price of that harvest change because two governments have entered a dispute thousands of miles away. None of these scenes appear on the package. That absence is part of what makes the modern soybean so powerful. Its history is not the story of one food replacing another. It is the story of a crop learning to serve several demands at once. It became oil without looking like a bean. It became animal protein without appearing on the plate. It entered fuel tanks, factories, processed food, and supermarket meat, while leaving its original shape behind. Each transformation made soy more useful. Each transformation also made its costs easier to move elsewhere. The labor could remain near the field. The land conflict could remain near the frontier. The ecological damage could remain outside the city. The consumer received the finished product after the distance had already been erased. That does not mean every soybean carries the same history or creates the same harm. It means that cheapness is never a complete description. When something looks inexpensive, part of its cost may simply have been paid in another place, by another person, under another name. So the next time a meal looks simple, look again. There may be a field inside it, a machine, a ship, a market, a history that began thousands of years before the package reached your hand. The soybean did not disappear from modern life. It disappeared inside it.